After Kirk filed for full custody of Kannon, Jasmine attacked Kirk's house. The courtroom was a place of silent judgment, but the tension between Kirk and Jasmine was deafening. For months, they had been embroiled in a bitter custody battle over their 6-year-old son, Kannon. Every lawyer's argument, every piece of evidence presented, felt like a volley of arrows shot at each other's heart. But the most defining moment, the one that could change everything, came when Kirk stood before the judge and asked for full custody of Kannon. He had never intended to escalate things this way, but his fear for his son's future and his growing concerns about Jasmine's behavior left him no other choice. As his lawyer made the formal request, Kirk felt a mix of guilt and relief. It wasn't that he didn't want to co-parent with Jasmine, he just couldn't watch his son slip through the cracks anymore. Kannon had been acting differently, more withdrawn and anxious, ever since living between two households. Kirk's decision hit Jasmine like a thunderclap. She had always been a fiery woman, a woman who never backed down from a fight. Her relationship with Kirk had been filled with passion, both good and bad, but they had shared one thing above all, a love for Kannon that ran deep. At least, that's what Jasmine told herself. But when she got the news that Kirk was filing for full custody, her world crumbled. How dare he think that he was the better parent? She had sacrificed so much for Kannon. He was her life. She was the one who had always been there for him when he was sick, the one who had spent countless sleepless nights worrying over his well-being, the one who had endured every hardship to make sure he had everything he needed. How could he be so blind? Jasmine's mind raced, spinning into a frenzy. She had to act. She couldn't lose her son. Not to Kirk. Not to anyone. The aftermath of the filing. The news of Kirk's request spread like wildfire. Jasmine could feel it in the air the moment she walked into her apartment that afternoon. Her friends, her neighbors, everyone could see it in her eyes. The fire was still burning. Her fists clenched at her sides as she thought about how Kirk had painted her as an unfit mother in court, accusing her of being too unstable, too unpredictable to care for their son. Jasmine knew he was just playing the system, and she wasn't going to let him win. She stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, staring at her reflection as though trying to find the woman she used to be. Who had she become? Was she the person who would let Kirk rip her family apart? No, she couldn't. She wouldn't. The plan begins. Kirk had always been protective of his house. His home, with its white picket fence and cozy charm, was his sanctuary. He had spent years turning it into a place of stability for Kannon, somewhere their son could feel safe and loved. Now, it was his fortress. But Jasmine had never been one to back down from a challenge, especially when it came to her son. She needed to remind Kirk who was really in charge. She wasn't going to just let him waltz away with her child, not without putting up a fight. That evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Jasmine's thoughts took a darker turn. She sat in her car outside Kirk's house, watching the lights flicker on in his windows. His home, her home, was just a few hundred feet away, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles. She felt distant from him, a stranger even, though they'd once been so close. The anger bubbled up inside her, hotter and stronger than anything she had ever felt. She was prepared to make him pay. She didn't know how yet, but she would make him regret what he had done. And in her mind, making him suffer for this betrayal meant showing him who had power in this relationship. She had nothing left to lose. The attack. Jasmine parked her car down the street from Kirk's house, her hands trembling on the steering wheel. She took a deep breath, the air thick with anticipation. There was no turning back now. With a glance toward the house, she opened the door and stepped out. Her sneakers made no sound on the grass as she crept toward the backyard. Kirk's security lights were off, but the soft hum of the neighborhood seemed to echo louder in her ears. She crouched low, her heart pounding in her chest. She had planned everything meticulously, at least, she thought she had. There was no way Kirk would be expecting her to do something so reckless. He'd never seen her like this before. Jasmine reached the back door of Kirk's house. She had a set of keys from a time when things had been good between them, and as much as she hated to admit it, she knew she'd need them. Her hand hesitated for just a moment before she slid the key into the lock. The door opened with a soft click. Inside, the house was silent. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Kirk was in the living room, sitting in his chair with a book. She could hear the faint rustling of pages as he turned them. The house was peaceful, almost too peaceful, and it made Jasmine's pulse quicken. She moved toward the hallway, her footsteps echoing softly on the hardwood floors. Her mind was racing, but there was one thought that kept repeating over and over in her head: she was going to get her son back. She would make him see that she wasn't weak. She wasn't someone to be pushed around. Suddenly, a voice broke the silence. Jasmine. Kirk's voice was calm, but there was a hint of confusion in it. She froze, her heart stopping for a split second. She didn't answer him. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out the letter she had written for him. The one where she outlined her final warning. It was filled with venom and bitterness. Every word she had wanted to say for years, written down in one ruthless letter. She tossed it on the ground in front of him, her eyes narrowing as she stepped back into the shadows. "You don't get to do this, Kirk," she said coldly, her voice trembling but firm. Kirk stood up from his chair, his expression unreadable. "Jasmine, what the hell are you doing here? Don't pretend you don't know," she spat. "You think you can just take Kannon from me? You think you can do whatever you want and I'll just sit back and let you? Not anymore. Not this time." Kirk's brow furrowed. "Jasmine, I'm not trying to take him away from you. I just want him to be safe. You're not stable. Don't talk to me about stability," she screamed, her voice rising in anger. "You think I'm unstable. You think you're a better parent than me. You don't know anything about me, Kirk. You never did. You were too busy playing the perfect dad to notice what was really going on. But you won't get away with it." Her words, sharp as daggers, pierced the air between them. The tension was so thick it felt like a suffocating fog. Kirk took a step toward her, his face a mixture of frustration and concern. "Jasmine, please, let's talk about this. You need help." "I don't need help," she shouted, backing away. "What I need is for you to understand that I'm not giving up on my son. I'm not giving up on him just because you want to play the hero." For a moment, Kirk stood frozen, eyes locked on hers. His expression softened, the anger in his features fading into something more uncertain. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The aftermath. Jasmine left that night without a word. Her mission wasn't complete, but the message had been sent. She knew Kirk would never forget what she had done. The balance of power had shifted, at least in her mind. But as she drove away from his house, something inside her began to unravel. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, but there was no satisfaction. No sense of victory. Just a hollow emptiness. Was this really worth it? Had she really won? When Kirk received the letter, it sent him into a spiral of emotions. The fear he had for Kannon's safety deepened, but so did his love for his son. He realized then that it wasn't about custody anymore, it was about healing. About finding a way to help Jasmine, and in turn, help Kannon. The next morning, he filed for a restraining order. He wasn't giving up on the fight for his son, but he would not allow things to spiral out of control. He loved Kannon more than anything in the world. And he wasn't going to lose him. Not now. Not ever.